This is SBS World News with Antoninus.
Good evening. After days of denying any responsibility, Iran has tonight admitted it unintentionally shot down a Ukrainian passenger plane which killed all 176 people on board. Tehran had initially rejected all assertions its own missiles struck the jet, despite claims from Western powers, including Australia, of mounting evidence. Now, Iranian state TV claims the Boeing 737 was brought down due to human error. Let's get more on this as we go live now to SBS Europe correspondent Ben Lewis, who is in Erbil, Iraq. Ben, tell us why the sudden admission of responsibility.
Well, Anton, good evening. It is incredibly rare for Tehran to admit any sort of wrongdoing in any situation, but in this case there was simply too much publicly available evidence showing that the airliner was brought down by a missile. Iran's president has described it as an unforgivable mistake, but there will be serious questions asked as to how it could happen, given that the plane had just departed the airport and was on a regular flight path. Still, this is a remarkable admission that few had been expecting.
This was the moment that had overwhelmingly bolstered claims the ill-fated Ukrainian Airlines flight did not crash due to a technical error. What appears to be a missile filmed in the last tracked position of the plane, followed by an incredible beam of light. Then an explosion seconds later. According to US officials, 2 Russian-supplied surface-to-air missiles were detected by American spy satellite and inevitably struck the aircraft. Iran fiercely refuted accusations it took out the jetliner as evidence suggested otherwise. Video showed bulldozers clearing debris from the crash site, raising fears the investigation was being compromised. And with the black box retrieved and international pressure mounting, a monumental about-face on Iranian state television with widespread geopolitical ramifications. A sad day, tweeted Iran's foreign minister. Preliminary conclusions of internal investigation by armed forces, human error at time of crisis caused by US adventurism led to disaster. Our profound regrets, apologies and condolences to our people, to the families of all victims, and to other affected nations. Tehran claiming the plane was mistaken for a hostile target, an unforgivable mistake, according to Iran's president. The admission as foreign investigators began to trickle into Tehran. Hours earlier, Canada, which lost 57 of its citizens in the crash, had stepped up pressure to have its own authorities granted greater access on site.
We repeat our call for a full and thorough investigation.
Canada's grief still overwhelming. In Toronto, a nighttime vigil saw communities unite to remember the victims. Alvan Sadiki, a talented pianist, was on board the flight. So too his wife Nagar, sister Sahand, and 5-year-old niece Sufi. Their friends and family struggling to comprehend the tragedy.
That just doesn't make sense. You never hear of such a story, but then as you keep reading and looking at the news and videos, then there's this anger.
Ukraine also paying tribute to its 11 killed. A makeshift memorial at Kiev airport, where the 737 was due to land, growing. The pilot's wife says she foresaw the tragedy and begged her husband not to go. His final words on board the aircraft, reportedly that all was well.
Of course I had some premonitions. I had a lot of premonitions. I asked him not to fly. I asked him not to do it. But he said, if not me, then no one else can fly.
Iran says the responsible parties will be held accountable, a staggering mea culpa in a scenario which Tehran had called scientifically impossible. Omar Dabaj, SBS World News.
The Trump administration has put into place new financial sanctions against several top Iranian officials in response to the regime's missile strikes against American military bases during the week. Here in Iraq, there is rising anger with mass demonstrations, protesters calling for Iran and the United States to stop trading blows on Iraqi soil. In cities across Iraq, protesters took to the streets as they have done for months, amid anger over corruption and unemployment. But after the events of the last week, the fight for change has a new focus. Anti-American and anti-Iranian slogans rang out amid fears Iraqis will become the collateral damage if tensions between the foreign powers intensify.
هذا يوم نعلن إنه ولائنا للعراق وللوطن فقط ولا التدخلات الخارجية مرفوضة رفضا تاما لأن ولائنا لهذا الوطن فقط.
The calls are backed by the country's top Shiite cleric.
يحكمه أبناؤه ولا دور للغرباء في قراراته يستند الحكم فيه.
There's a very public feud over whether US forces will stay in Iraq. Baghdad has asked Washington to send a delegation to plan a US troop withdrawal. The State Department rebuffed that, insisting America is a force for good in the Middle East. The firestorm ignited when a US drone assassinated Iranian General Qasem Soleimani in Baghdad. Under pressure from senators to explain the intelligence that led to the killing, the US Secretary of State said it would have been negligent to not take action.
We had specific information on an imminent threat, and those threat stream included attacks on US embassies. Period. Full stop.
So you were mistaken when you said you didn't know precisely when and you didn't know precisely where?
Nope, completely true. Those are completely consistent thoughts.
President Trump later told Fox News that Iran was about to target 4 embassies.
Probably it was going to be the embassy in Baghdad. I can reveal that I believe it would have been 4 embassies.
But that claim has been disputed by US defence officials. The Washington Post also reports the US military had tried to kill another senior Iranian official in Yemen on the same day Soleimani was killed, but failed. Iran responded to the assassination of Soleimani by firing more than 24 missiles at US military interests in Iraq. President Trump promised sanctions in response. They've now taken effect.
We are taking action against 8 senior Iranian officials who advanced the regime's destabilizing activity and were involved in Tuesday's ballistic missile strike.
One of those sanctioned officials described the restrictions as symbolic. In Brussels, EU foreign ministers have met with NATO chiefs to try and work out how the Iranian nuclear deal can be saved. One top French diplomat warning that if the accord collapses completely, Iran could have a functioning nuclear weapon within 2 years.
NATO's Secretary-General enters the EU Council building for crisis talks with Europe's foreign ministers. At the top of the agenda, salvaging the Iran nuclear deal and de-escalating tensions in the region.
The region cannot afford another war, and we call for an urgent de-escalation and maximum restraint to every part. The crisis risks jeopardizing years of effort to stabilize Iraq.
Those efforts were the product of America, Europe and the Iraqis working together. But after the assassination of General Qasem Soleimani, Brussels and Baghdad are increasingly at odds with Washington.
The United States has to wake up to the reality that the people of this region are enraged, that the people of this region want the United States out.
While Washington announced fresh economic sanctions on Iran, European leaders chose not to trigger a dispute resolution process which could see new UN sanctions on the Islamic Republic. But nuclear fears are mounting. Tehran announced on Sunday it was ditching all the restrictions on its enrichment program, leaving European powers scrambling to keep the 2015 nuclear deal alive.
They aren't currently in a situation where they could develop them. But if they keep distancing themselves from the nuclear deal, then yes, within 1 or 2 years, they could have nuclear weapons. This is inconceivable to us. And the best method to avoid such a situation is diplomacy, negotiation, respecting the deal.
The deal brokered between Iran and other world leaders has been at risk of collapse since May 2018, when the Trump administration walked away from the pact, demanding a tougher stance on Iran. As US sanctions began to bite, Tehran steadily wound back compliance with the limits set under the nuclear accord. Europe continues to insist negotiations are the way forward.
This is not the end of the game, and we hope that we will help Iran to return to the game.
Tehran has said its moves away from the agreement are reversible, but only if Washington lifts its sanctions and returns to the deal. Virginia Langberg, SBS World News.
Finally from here in Iraq, some tragic news from the southern city of Basra. An Iraqi journalist and his cameraman were killed, shot dead in their car while covering the protests there. The reporter, Anton, had been a high-profile critic of Iran's influence in the country.
That is Ben Lewis updating us live there on the US-Iran crisis and events in Iraq itself.